Greetings, race community. Brent coming in live with today's guest, Rodney Kirsch, who this Tuesday is a Senior Vice President at Grenzebach, Glier & Associates, and Senior Vice President, Emeritus Development and Alumni Relations, Penn State University. Welcome, Rod.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, we have been playing a bit of email and calendar tag since episode 93, when our mutual colleague, Mark Llewellyn, currently Senior Vice President at University of Virginia, was raving about you. And so we figured we should see what all the hype is about and get you on the episode ourselves. So here we are, Rod. Thanks for joining us. And as you might be aware, one of my favorite, first of all, to everybody listening, Rod has had a unparalleled career leading advancement organizations. He knows everybody. He has countless stories that we won't even be able to get into today, but we'll get into some of them. But before all of that stuff happened, Rod had to go to college himself. And so, Rod, I would love for you to take me back to senior year of high school. Who was that guy and what led him to the University of North Dakota?
Yeah. Well, I was blessed that I had, my parents were not college educated, so I was first generation, but they had a value for education beyond probably anything else. So education was very much a part of who we were. My father was on the school board for many years. So there was no question really that I was going to go to college. And the question was just where and what was I going to do? We didn't have enough money for me to go anywhere out of state. So there were really two options. And I chose the one that was the University of North Dakota, mainly because I was going to be an English major. I kind of pretty much determined that. Loved literature, loved writing, and at UND, they required English majors to have a minor in a foreign language. And I thought that was a little bit higher hurdle than the other institution I was looking at. And so that's how I ended up there. In my second year there as a sophomore, I joined a fraternity, which became a really influential part of what my college career, but also my life thereafter in terms of kind of the doors that opened and so forth. So,
well, tell me more about that. Also, what was the language?
The language was German. So I'm of German heritage and background, and there was a little bit of German spoken in my home, mainly when my parents didn't want me to know what they were talking about. They could both speak German. So that was it. And that was a pretty common thing where I grew up, was for people to either study German if they didn't know it or speak German if they had that kind of ancestry.
And any German you want to dust off for our listeners today?
Guten Tag. Wie geht es Ihnen?
All right, works for me.
How are you today, Brent?
Works for me. So tell me more about the fraternity experience, and just by way of, the intersections I referenced before we went live, fellow first-gen student, and fraternity leadership was really a formative part of my college experience, in addition to my athletic endeavors as well. And so I'd love to know more about what aspects of that fraternity were important in the college experience, but ultimately, is that where you sort of first got intersection with the alumni and fundraising world?
Well, it's interesting. I eventually became the alumni relations chair, and so that was my final kind of job in the fraternity, where I actually took care of the alumni newsletter and did some things like that. But the best part of it is that I just happened to be probably very fortunate to end up in a chapter that had a lot of really bright guys, a lot of diverse backgrounds in terms of academic disciplines and so forth. There were like 20 guys in my pledge class, and we had our first semester, we had a 3.4 grade point average, and I think 7 of us had straight 4.0s. So these are a bunch of really bright guys, future doctors, engineers, attorneys, and so forth. It was great to be around these guys, to be challenged by them, to learn from them, to, when I was younger, to look up to them and so forth. And so that's what's really led me then to my first job, to work for my college fraternity. And that's really where I got to have some appreciation and understanding for, volunteerism, governing boards, fundraising, and the like was really when I worked for Delta Upsilon International Fraternity.
Well, as you know, the movie Animal House was released your senior year of college, and it sounds like you had a very different experience than was portrayed in the film.
Yeah, I may have attended a record number of Toga parties when I traveled my first year, and even got to the University of Oregon where Animal House was filmed. I could say that, I mean, it's a very funny movie, probably a little bit out of date in this era. And fortunately, my house wasn't quite as wild as the one portrayed in the movie, but we did have a lot of fun, as I recall. And
but so for those 2 years, though, out of college, you basically joined as a full-time employee of the national fraternity, and then were essentially campus to campus as a liaison.
Yeah, so I did that work for 2 years, and over the 2 years, visited about 80 different college campuses. So I really got to see America.
I mean, what's that? I was going to say, like, so as a fellow first gen student who had not traveled very much by the time I went to college, I imagine you hadn't traveled all that much, given what you described. Going and seeing, I mean, my family and I just did an RV trip during the pandemic. We did 34 states in 10 months. It sounds like that was
cool.
sort of, aligned with your travel during that period. I mean, 80 campuses. Tell me some of the highlights and the lowlights, because there had to be some of those too.
Well, I mean, you could tell kind of the moment you walked into a chapter house if it was a good chapter or not. It was a perfect job right out of school for doing. I mean, I really did get to see, this country and Canada, because we had Canadian chapters as well. It had to deal with a lot of, interesting, diverse situations. It was a very autonomous job because we literally, those of us who did this work, packed up our suitcase at the end of August when semester started, and came back to our headquarters the second week in December. So we literally lived out of our suitcase, had to make all of our own travel arrangements, and really had to work ourselves out of a fix if we got into one. Had to be pretty resilient, and sometimes had to stand up in front of a group of guys that were probably no more than 2 or 3 years younger than me, and deliver some hard news from time to time, and that all kind of served me well many years later when I was managing a team of obviously adults, managing a team and needing to take a leadership role and convey tough news sometimes.
Rod, I didn't know we'd spend this much time on this part of your career, but I'm finding it very interesting. And to do that job a couple years out of college or a year out of college, 80 campuses, live out of a suitcase without a cell phone, without an email address, no internet access, like literally, how did you stay in touch and organized during that period?
Well, it made it even more self-sufficient, because we didn't. I mean, technology was a dinosaur. It was an ice age or two ago. So I had just one call in every week at 10 o'clock on Tuesday morning. Still remember the day and the time. I'd call into headquarters and had a 30-minute chat with my boss. And that's about the only there was no email, there was nothing of that nature. So we would file reports. We had to find a typewriter every place I went. Either undergraduate lent me one, or sometimes I had to go to the library. I mean, so there are all kinds of things, but it was just part of being, I guess, self-sufficient and just doing what needed to be done. So. Yeah.
Sounds like you were doing remote work before it was cool. Huh?
Yeah, I guess you could say that. Yeah.
So what led you to pursue the master's program at the University of Indiana? Tell me about that.
Well, my boss, I had a wonderful first boss in life, a guy by the name of Bill Butler. So I've been really blessed with amazing mentors throughout my career. So the very first one was a guy by the name of Bill Butler. So he was the executive director of the fraternity. He really encouraged me to go on to get a degree. He always thought I should become a college president, and I really did not have interest in being in a classroom and doing all that for like 6 years to get a doctoral degree and so forth. And so anyway, he really encouraged me to go to Indiana University. It had a great student affairs program. I was actually initially interested in admissions work. And there are a lot of, when you think about it, there's a lot of similarities between an admissions professional and an advancement professional in terms of the work. But then I got, and again, through the fraternity, I got an assistantship at the Alumni Association at IU. And I lived the first year of my graduate program in the DU house in Bloomington, Indiana. So I was a graduate advisor. So between those two gigs, I really didn't have any, my degree was paid for. And so that was really useful, and again gave me an opportunity to learn about this whole world of alumni relations and ultimately fundraising. I had an internship my second year at the College of Arts and Sciences, where a gentleman by the name of Gene Temple, those who follow the academic side, let's say, of philanthropy would know Gene's name. Gene was the founding dean of the Lilly School of Philanthropy at Indiana University. But at that time, he was a director of development, the first constituent development officer that Indiana University ever had. That was in 1981. So I and Gene became another really great mentor for me, and he and I are still in touch with each other 40 some years later.
And at what point, with the interest in student affairs or enrollment, for example, did you start to pursue the advancement work, and ultimately what led you to Drake?
So this actually turned out to be another connection that I learned about in the Alumni Association office. So the gentleman by the name of Kent Dove, who was the vice president for institutional advancement at Drake University, and I just started applying for all kinds of advancement positions and roles, and I was, so I had 2 years of work experience at the fraternity, 2 years in graduate school, and I started just everything. And in those days, again, there was, no internet and so forth. So I would spend evenings typing up letters on a typewriter and sending them off through the post office to various jobs. Now, when I look back, I think how silly, because I would guess about 75% of those things I applied to, I had no qualifications truly to get a position. But I ended up at Drake. Kent was an Indiana graduate, actually. And so I think that caught his attention that I also was soon to be an IU grad with my master's degree. We had an interview and we hit it off, and I think he offered me the whopping starting salary of $15,000. And I said, "Can you go up another $1,000, Kent?" And so I started out with a $16,000 salary in 1982 as I think it was the assistant director of annual giving and assistant director of alumni relations. So I did a phone program, a very unsophisticated phone program, I might add, compared to these days. And then I started an alumni chapter program when I was at Drake for those 3 years.
So by the time your episode is published, we will have also published an episode with Eileen Savage. I don't know if you ever crossed paths with Eileen.
Yeah, of course I have.
But Eileen, would anybody that's been listening to the show will know that Eileen was just talking about Kent Dove and his books. And so he kind of went down that whole path. But it's just another reminder of how much the sector is truly relationship based, but how much everybody knows everybody. And so, just thought you might appreciate knowing that. And I'd love to know more about just those early years. I mean, you're talking about, applying for jobs with typewriters, were trying to run an annual fund program in the mid 80s. What does that entail? I mean, what did you really do? Any memories from those early days that made you think, hey, maybe I could do this for a long time?
Well, I mean, part of this work is, part of it is relational, and a big piece of it. And I learned a lot about that from people along the way about developing relationships. But part of it is very strategic and metrics driven and so forth, and much more so than it was 40 years ago. So I kind of enjoyed both parts of it, the creative part of it, that it entailed, and I suppose that was kind of falls back to my English major days and so forth. But what I really learned from Kent was one of the best strategists I was ever around in terms of this work. And eventually I met a man by the name of Kurt Simic when I went to Berkeley, and Kurt was no one better in building relationships than Kurt in this business. So those early days were, though, I mean, running an annual giving program now, because we didn't have any of the technology at that time, it was a lot of hard work, and it was fairly inefficient, actually, compared to how we do things now. But to this day, and when I began to manage people and then manage an entire program, I will never regret having done kind of that slave labor as, working in a annual giving program, because I really appreciate what it takes and how important it is to the fundamental process of fundraising, and the cycles that donors go through. Most of our mega donors started out with a gift of $10 or $25. Everyone, I think, knows the famous, Michael Bloomberg's first gift to Johns Hopkins was $5, the year he graduated. So I really learned the importance of building a pipeline, building a base, what that all meant.
Can I ask, when you think about all the technology change that has happened, what hasn't changed? I mean, what do you think is the same today about running an annual fund, if anything, as it was then?
I'm not so well. We tried to, as best we could, do segmentation and so forth. But again, there were no analytics at that time as we have sophistication about it now, and so that has changed a lot. The thing that hasn't changed is I think how we're better at doing messaging now, but even though the delivery or the channels that we were using were not as sophisticated, we still had to think about what we were saying to people and what's the case in terms of what we were asking them to do in terms of supporting an institution and so forth. Kent and I had a marvelous 2-hour conversation, not too long before Kent passed away, and we talked a little bit about this and how, a lot of the things now have changed from a standpoint of technology and the metrics and analytics. The one thing that I don't think will ever change is the relationship piece of our work. And so understanding people's motivations, understanding their values, understanding, how we can talk to them about the impact that donors can make with their philanthropy. I mean, that has not changed. And because so much of that is, understanding human nature itself, that will never change. And Kent and I used to joke a little bit about, as sophisticated as we get about all these things, a computer, a telephone is never going to ask somebody for, a gift of $1 million or $10 million or whatever. It still comes down to, can you do this work with, and relate to people at their level and understand them?
I think that's a great point. And when you think about, even in the take away the philanthropy world, but when you think about the world of commerce more broadly, there is absolutely a sliding scale of the importance of human to human connection and price point, right? So if you think about in the commercial world, as easy as it's gotten to pay with your phone or to quickly transact, at a certain price point, it doesn't matter how easy it is to do those things or how good the website is. There is a threshold at which people want to talk to people, and they want to be able to have questions answered, concerns, additional perspective and context. And that applies in the commercial sector where, price points, generally, there aren't a lot of things that people are buying for more than 5 or certainly 6 figures. You then go to the philanthropy world where you literally get to 9 figures in some cases. And I think it is highly likely that as much technology innovation happens, and obviously I'm betting my career on that continuing to happen, it is not going to replace the human to human element that is going to drive the vast majority of philanthropic revenue.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, and regardless of the communication channel and so forth, that one of the really important things that all of us need to appreciate is that probably the most important thing that we do in our work, and it revolves around the value of trust. We don't have someone's trust, if we don't have a benefactor's trust in who we are, what our institution stands for, that we're going to do the right thing, what the donor wants, and honor donor intent, we're not going to be successful in this work. So we've got to be able to build genuine trust with people, because that's, in reality, other than people having hopefully a lot of joy from their philanthropy, trust is about the only thing we can promise back, in that sense. So that's a very important, and that transcends whatever the communication channel is.
Well said. If we hadn't talked about your couple of year stint traveling to 80 campuses and Canada, I would have been more confused by your next career stop, which was to go from Drake University to UC Berkeley. And I would have asked you about the culture shock of your sheltered Midwestern upbringing and what that was like. But now I know you went to more Toga parties than anybody, so it probably wasn't as big of a shock.
Well, it's still, I mean, Drake, I'm actually doing some consulting work right now at Drake, and Drake was such a marvelous place for me to get started. And I still have, in fact, I was just back there last week, and saw some people that I know from those days. But Berkeley was really another step up in terms of the magnitude of the institution, complexity of it, the prowess of what Cal, as most people would know it, would refer to it as Cal, CAL, there were just a lot of really bright, intelligent people running around that place that really were making some real big impact, or were bound to. I was a little worried when I went there because I knew I'd be dealing probably in terms of the kind of the heart of the philanthropic support that I was going to be doing with major gift work. I'd be dealing with people who had graduated from there in the 40s and 50s and 60s, well before, the free speech movement and everything that Berkeley then became known for, and in terms of the unrest in the late 60s. But these people love this institution. Those that graduated before the unrest in the late 60s, love the place, and as much as those that graduated, in the 70s and 80s. And so it really taught me about how people get to be kind of the DNA of a place, really gets to be a part of somebody that cares about the university, cares about their alma mater. And so we had these are the days when campaigns then, for example, that campaign was $320 million, and then it increased to $400 million. And I mean, those are, there's a lot of places now that's kind of a good year, not a 6-year campaign total. That's just one single good year to do $300 or $400 million. So the magnitudes of things are very different, but the processes, the principles are all the same. And Cal was fairly, I think Kurt would say, Kurt Simic was the vice chancellor there. That's how I met Kurt. Kurt would say that that the program, he was, one of the things I think he did there was to build some professionalism into the fundraising and advancement program at UC Berkeley.
As you think about your time in that role, my understanding is that was a little bit more of the road warrior, frontline gift officer, producer role. Is that right?
Right, exactly. Yep.
Any memorable visits or, positive outcomes or negative outcomes that you reflect on?
Well, I mean, it's it's not easy, picking up the phone and trying to get appointments and do cold calls and so forth. And I remember reading shortly before I went there, Lee Iacocca. Many people, won't remember Iacocca, but he was chairman of Chrysler Motor Company and brought it out of bankruptcy and he then chaired the Statue of Liberty restoration project and was, by any respects, a great American. But in his book, in the first or second chapter, he talks about when he was at Chrysler as a young kid, how he would literally, and he had to go out and make sales calls, how he would literally write down on paper what he was going to say in his phone conversations, So I kind of reflected on that. I thought, well, if Lee Iacocca went through that stage in his career about being a little intimidated to call up someone and say, I'd like to come and see you to talk to you about, in this case, UC Berkeley, I thought, okay, so not so bad if I have a little bit of nervousness and anxiety about it. But I found that I love the work. I love getting to meet people, understanding who they were. I still have my first six-figure gift came from an elderly woman. Mary Ann Herberger was her name. She was a Cal graduate from probably the 20s or something like that, 20s or 30s. I mean, she's elderly, and still remember going to visit with her, and kind of the joy that she had that somebody from the university had come to see her. She was in a retirement center in Santa Barbara, and I asked her if she'd consider a gift, and she pro-offered $100,000, and still have that pledge form. Actually, it's kind of one of the it's for me. It kind of says a lot about kind of where I started. But that was fun. And then she, like many people, she just loved, reminiscing about the place. And, I kept that relationship going. She gave some more gifts even after that first one, so.
And that's a common, I think, arc that we hear, Rod, is, that dynamic of cold calling, right? And, whether it's the call center in your annual fund days where you're literally cold calling, or you're then a frontline officer, using that persistence to try to secure a meeting, and you almost feel bad about it. But then you have conversations like the one you just shared. And it just seems like in every leader's career that we've covered on this podcast, a switch flips at some point where you stop feeling bad about reaching out to somebody, and you start feeling proud or excited. Or even if you get a clear no, instead of you feeling bad about that, you feel good that at least now that there's a clear no, and you can go prioritize your time elsewhere. Or you find out why there's a clear no, and you see if you can make it right if it's not too far gone. And I'm just curious for, is that what you've seen, not just in your own career, but with other folks that you've led?
Yeah, Brent, really excellent points. I mean, that is indeed, as you just described it, indeed the case. And I think one of the things we all learn is there are possibly more no's than yeses in terms of what we do, but it's really to get used to that and to be able to understand, and then. The wins they're not so much become wins anymore as just the building and connecting people with an institution that they care about. And so those really kind of, keep you in the game and so forth. Kent Dove used to, Kent used to have all these little expressions typed in little 3x5 cards that he'd keep in his briefcase. And one of them was, I'd rather have you make heirs of commission than heirs of omission. And Kent had a very active, proactive part of his, I think, philosophy. So I learned right away that, there are going to be, you will be successful in this work if indeed you are out there attempting, and sometimes you're going to try and fail and so forth. The other thing that I learned from, and I was fortunate enough to meet and know Hank Rosso. Now, some of your viewers will not know who Hank is. It's Rosso. Hank created the fundraising school, which became, which he essentially gifted to Indiana University, to the Center of Philanthropy. This was well before the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy at Indiana University. But Hank had an important philosophy in that you should never, ever apologize for asking someone for an organization to benefit some entity that you feel proud about and that deserves support. So, and I think it's a really important thing for people entering this work to say, and I oftentimes talk about it, because when we ask people for a gift, they'll sometimes, that moment of silence after, Brent, I ask you to consider a gift of $500,000 to do something, is one of the more awkward moments people usually have in this work. Not everybody has born with the DNA chip that makes that an easy thing to do. But one of the tendency is to always say, well, Brent, I know that's a lot of money. Or even worse, to say, Brent, if that's too much, maybe you could do 100,000. And so, we ought to never apologize for asking. And I think Hank would say something like, never clothe and ask in a blanket of apology, which in his vernacular, that's how he described that. So I think it's an important thing to think about. And it bleeds into really the fact of the work that we do is important. It changes lives, and it has just the material impact on the organizations that we care about and work for. So there's no reason to apologize for asking someone to make a stretch gift.
It sounds like not only not apologize, but also be comfortable, get comfortable with that uncomfortable moment after the ask. Knowing that they might be thinking, I thought he was going to ask for $1 million. Not, I wish he would have asked for 100,000. It could go both ways, right? Yeah. And I'm sure you have instances. Now, I might want to ask you, do you have instances where you have asked for too much money in hindsight, or that you have not asked enough? And how do you think about calibrating the ask around a specific number, a range? How do you kind of go from, well, it could be 100,000 or $1 million or somewhere in between, but I've got to put a figure in front of somebody.
Yeah. Well, you try to do good homework on all that, and you're never quite certain. I think the important thing is that you're asking permission to have a gift conversation with somebody, so it doesn't come out of the blue. But we actually do a lot of training around this, and so there's a lot of ways, everything from having good research to having insight from others about this person, to understanding what range of gifts a person may have made in the past, to maybe having some sense about what their gift capacity and wealth is. I mean, there's a lot of things that are probably tangible, but then there's also those things that, you try to inspire people. You try to have people know others and get to know others who have been, great benefactors, and have great benefactors who are already, quote, in the fold, to tell their stories to people that you're trying to approach for a gift. And so I could tell you lots of stories about going on gift conversation calls. We're bringing a volunteer along who actually, the volunteer, I had a wonderful volunteer couple, gentleman who chaired the first campaign I did at Penn State, and he and his wife was chaired one of our college campaign committees in her academic college. They did a marvelous job of telling why they had made this really very large stretch gift for them. And that is all it took to convince this other couple that they needed to stretch as well. So I'm a huge believer in volunteer engagement and getting volunteers to help us in any way that they feel comfortable.
Well, in your 26 years at Penn State, which not a lot of people cross that 25-year mark in this sector, Rod, in the 26 years at Penn State, what are some of the memories that stand out, whether it's with those specific volunteers or key milestones? I mean, because look, you arrived in the mid 90s, probably. I don't know if on your first day there you got an email address. It was 1996, so probably a year early. But you left by well, technically you're emeritus, so you have never left. And so I'm just curious, when you think about the world of philanthropy and advancement in 1996 compared to 2016, for example, when your full-time role concluded. I'm curious what reflections you have.
Yeah, there's so many, and almost all of them good. We lived through a really tough time at Penn State when we through a scandal and a crisis, but for the most part, what wonderful memories. And I think one of the things I really learned, particularly working with large donors and key volunteers, was the importance of stewardship. We had quite a number of repeat donors, people who, this couple I was just explaining to you, they made a $5 million gift as a campaign chair couple, so to speak. And that was a large gift for them at that point in their lives. And since then, they've given much more to Penn State. But I think we did really great stewardship. And there are quite a number of people. The largest donor I worked with at the time, a couple that made a gift to endow the Honors College at Penn State, Bill and Joan Schreier by name. About 8 or 9 years after the first large gift, they made a second large gift. So in all of these, there's a stewardship story behind them, and multiple relationships back to the institution. So this idea that, this donor or this prospect is mine and mine only, really bad idea. What we find when we kind of do the study of donors who give $1 million or more is the vast majority of them have multiple relationships at our institutions, and they give to multiple places within the institution. So having multiple relationships, as long as they're coordinated, is really what you want to do, what you want to have, and is really a good thing. So learned that. I think I learned the importance of institutional leadership. I worked for, I enjoyed my relationship with the president who had hired me for 16 years. We worked together. We had a lot of fun. We worked really hard, but he was really a strong fundraising president. So I learned the importance of presidential leadership and fundraising, and how important that can be. I learned the importance of a great staff and taking care of a great staff, and trying to, my role as a vice president, while I did a lot of principal gift fundraising, my role, probably a principal role, was trying to create an environment and give my team the tools so that all of them could be successful. So that's probably, I could reminisce a lot about some of the really nice gifts we got. Probably more important and less visible, I imagine, is some of the things I tried to do behind the scenes, or the bullets you take as a vice president that no one really knows you're taking, and so forth, to really make the work easier and more successful for the people that are on your advancement team. So I hope I was able to do that, and that people that work for me can go away and say, I enjoy working for Rod, because he, it was fun to be around, and he gave us the leadership we needed at certain points in time.
Rod, can I ask you, in that senior vice president role, I do think it's unique in the philanthropy sector, where oftentimes in the commercial sales world, the higher up you move, the less direct client relationship management work you do. And it's more about recruiting, training, and leading a team. And in fact, there is a point at which, if you have any direct client relationships, your board or people might start to question, why is that the case? Yet in this world of philanthropy, it is so common for senior vice presidents to not only have a portfolio or manage relationships, if you will, but have some of the most important relationships. And I'm always intrigued and a little bit confused about why that is the case, given that you have all the other institutional stuff to deal with, the bullets to take, the issues to deal with, and it's your job to help create a great experience for some of the most just highest potential from a capacity perspective donor relationships. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, and it's in a similar fashion. We kind of take really good major gift fundraisers, and we make them associate vice presidents. We turn them into managers, and then they don't have as much time to be that great fundraiser and so forth. So I don't know. Penn State was a place where I think there was a bit of a tradition before I got there that if you were going to talk about major philanthropy, you were usually ending up talking to the president and or the vice president for development. And so, so that was part of kind of a bit of the culture of the place. But I knew probably ultimately once I had a team built and we got that first campaign organized and on the road, I knew that, one of my main responsibilities was actually going to be at a, principal giving level. So I probably had an active portfolio of 65 or 70, pretty good prospects, and work with them. The other point that I think you just cannot overlook as a vice president is that you are a role model, like it or not, to everybody else that works with you. And if they don't see you out doing the work that you're asking them to do, if they don't see you out making calls and putting together proposals and trying to close gifts and so forth, you don't nearly have a strong case to kind of keep compelling them to do that work. So I kind of always took the approach that I'm not going to ask anybody to do something that I would want to do myself or have done myself. So I think being that role model is really very important.
Leading by example matters, right? And I think it's a balance of how much leading by example. And I'm sure there's some senior vice presidents that probably love that fundraising work so much it's hard to not do it. And then others that maybe give up too much of that. And I'm sure striking the balance is important. Can I just ask, when you think about your time there, you had a bunch of people, grow up with you during that time period as professionals. You've mentioned Dave Lieb. We talked about Mark Llewellyn, Eloise Bryce, Pam Buell. There are people that you've had the opportunity to help grow, and coach, and now they're obviously amazing leaders in their own right. But what's it like, kind of having that alumni community, if you will, as it relates to your resume?
Well, it's still fun, and all those people you mentioned, I still am in contact with, and they reach out every once in a while to me, and so that's, you just develop some of those personal relationships. But I just see it to some extent as kind of paying it forward or paying it backwards. I don't know what the right way to put it, but I had some people that like Kent Dove and Kurt Simic and Gene Temple, and there were a few others that really took an interest in me in my career when I was young. And so it's a way to kind of give back to the profession. I still enjoy doing things like that. I've been recruited back to come onto the Big Ten Fundraisers Institute again after having done it for 15 years. They thought they needed some old consultant with gray hair to come back on, and so I think you have some responsibility to do some things like that, and I certainly try to do that. Probably have not done nearly enough of it, to be honest with you, but yeah, it's really rewarding to see people that leave your Mark Llewellyn's a good example. Mark was a rising star, and we just weren't going to keep Mark forever. But it's really rewarding to see people go on, to more challenging responsibilities and have the kinds of career successes and so forth. So that's an intangible thing that you just, there's that you can't put a price tag on it. So it's a lot of fun to see it.
I will share quickly that while you acknowledge some of the challenges that you went through at Penn State, one of the silver linings, I think, was, maybe it was the 2012 or 2013 season. I played football at Brown University, and we were all so proud when Bill O'Brien stepped in and, really I think helped get things on a good trajectory. Curious if you cross paths at all. And moreover, just when you think about it, not necessarily at Penn State, but more broadly, the importance of athletics from an affinity perspective and, the ways that we can harness athletics engagement to philanthropy, even if the philanthropy isn't around athletics itself.
Yeah. Well, there are certain types of institutions where many people kind of get engaged and see the institution through the lens of athletics first, perhaps. And that's a good thing. If you're really smart about how you do things, you build relationships around people's interest in athletics and intercollegiate athletics and sports programs and so forth. So there is some advantage there that some institutions have that, blend very nicely with advancement work. By the way, just a side point about Bill O'Brien, I did work with Bill. Bill was a man of high character integrity. I was really so sad when Bill left. Bill always wanted to be an NFL head coach, and so he left to go to the Houston Texans to kind of fulfill his dream. But he was the perfect guy for the time that we were in at that point. But getting back to we did so much work around different, particularly football weekends at a place like Penn State, but other kinds of sports as well. And it was a rallying point for people, but it brought people to campus. And one of the things that I think if you're working in a university or a college, if you can get people on campus to resurrect all those great memories that they had when they were there as a student, maybe they met their husband or their wife there and so forth. And that emotion is such an important piece of giving. And resurrecting some of those emotions and some of the feelings that people had about how important this place was at that point, that turning point. So traditional students, certainly from that 18 to 22-year-old period, many of us grew up then, so to speak. And that's a real turning point for people. So what athletics does is really brings people back to campus. And then once you have them there, you can do a lot of things with them. You can get them in the classroom. You can get them to talk to student groups. You could get them in seminars with honor students. You can do, you can have your volunteer meetings and so forth. And so that's an ancillary benefit that I think athletics really has as it relates to generally fundraising for anything.
I'll say, Rod, while that has historically been the case, I do think that is one of the opportunities we have coming out of the pandemic period, which is historically we needed people to come to campus to get that engagement, to have that conversation. Just with the Brown Football Association, for example, having a whole all generations of our alumni now knowing what Zoom is and how to use it, we've started having record attendance in board meetings from alumni from all over the country who are 80 years old, 90 years old, who never would have come to those meetings in Providence. And so I think part of the opportunity around technology now is how do we create how do we bring that campus experience and push it more broadly now that we're all a Zoom link away? And it can't just be we do a Zoom conversation all the time, but I do think that kind of emotional connection that historically you needed to be in the stadium to get, it's more possible to deliver at least some of that digitally in a way that we couldn't do even before the pandemic.
Oh, you make such an important point. And we're able to deliver academic content that's very interesting from, so many of our institutions have amazing faculty. And so the reach that they now have is tremendous through this kind of technology that we're using right now. So I think it's a really important. I think the nature of our work has changed probably for good in some respects, and I think that's good. And we'll adapt what things we can do well by use of technology like Zoom, and we'll continue to do things where we think we want to bring people together, in person. But it's a very, very good point you just made.
Rod, can I ask, as you've spent the last several years and recognizing there was sort of the pre-pandemic period, the pandemic period, and now whatever period we're in, what has the consulting experience been like? Is that something you always knew you were going to pursue, or how did it come about? Obviously, GG&A has an amazing reputation, incredible relationships. Just what are some of the highlights for folks who are listening and maybe thinking, hey, maybe someday I'd like to do that?
Yeah. Well, I had done a little bit of it along the way before I left Penn State, but I still felt I had a little bit of gas in the tank left when I left Penn State, and it was 21 years in that chair as a vice president was probably maybe longer than it probably should have been in some respects. But I was ready to go on and tackle some of the things, and so the consulting work interested me. I'm really enjoying it. I've gotten progressively busier, maybe on the shade of getting a little too busy. I tell people I'm failing retirement with a capital F. But it has changed. So I joined the GG&A 5+ years ago, and we were doing a lot of our work, obviously on campuses, in person. So much of that now during the pandemic switched to doing things remotely. I would say a couple things. First of all, there is still nothing quite like being there and to get the real sense of a room or of a person and so forth. Zoom will never substitute for that. But we're able to do a lot of, particularly the one-on-one work that we do. For example, if we're doing program reviews, or we're interviewing people one-on-one, or we're doing feasibility studies, or we're interviewing people one-on-one, this technology that we're using right now is absolutely, I think it's almost better in some respects than being in person. We seem to get more undivided attention from somebody and so forth. It's still very difficult. Not a fan of trying to deliver educational content and do training or seminars. Or I was last week I was talking to a board of trustees, and fortunately it was in person. I visit with the same group remotely. It's just not the same as being able to walk around a room. So but I think there are efficiencies and economies here that institutions are seeing, where they say, well, we don't really need you on campus for this. You could do this remotely. So it gives us, I think, actually an option or options that we didn't have before. And it works well for some things, but not as well for others. I think this will change. I mean, I will not be taking nearly as many airplane rides, I think, in the next few years as I did, pre-pandemic, and still probably, hopefully, deliver the same level of value to clients that we've had in the past. So GG&A really, I don't have any management responsibilities there, but we really pivoted very quickly to delivering content. We did, we did seminars like this. We did blogs and so forth, and so podcasts. So we pivoted quickly, and I think we delivered some good content, and we helped other institutions do it as well.
So Rod, can I ask you to put a number on it? Do you end up traveling 20% of what you used to, 50% of what you used to? Where do you think it lands?
If I think now what the future holds compared to where I was, I probably maybe 30 or 40% less, I'm guessing.
And is that what you think the future holds for principal gift officers too? 30 to 40% less than pre-pandemic?
What's really difficult that we've learned, and I think all institutions have, is developing that early relationship still is really kind of difficult on Zoom. I think gift officers still haven't quite mastered that, are kind of reluctant to do cold calls on Zoom and so forth. Once you've gotten to know somebody, you can have a relationship. I mean, there are 7- and 8-figure gifts now being closed, obviously, where you're not in person with the donor. So I think, but that early start, that building that trust that we talked about a few minutes ago, is so much better done in person. But thereafter, there's a lot of ways where you can if you're going to have a donor meeting with a financial or a legal advisor for a donor, doing that on Zoom, we've done some of that. I mean, that works pretty well, actually. And so.
Rod, we had asked in advance if you wanted to give any shout outs here on the podcast. You'd reference maybe some of the folks down at the University of Houston. Tell me more about why you feel that way, and then we'll tie things up here at the end.
Well, that to me, that's kind of a great story. So the University of Houston had not had a campaign in 25 years. My good friend and colleague, Eloise Bryce, became vice president there now almost a decade ago. And they launched a $1 billion campaign, probably had no real, no real business trying to raise that kind of money. But they exceeded their goal in the same time frame that they had projected to do so. That they were flying a jumbo jet and building it at the same time, still with not a lot of strength around their infrastructure and so forth. And one of the most efficient programs actually that I've been around, I mean, in terms of dollars raised versus dollars spent. But again, that's leadership. Eloise is a strong leader, and she's a great principal gift officer, and so she really demonstrated the importance of a vice president to carry a principal gift portfolio. So that's a fun story for me to have worked with them for a while and see the success that they've had. But there are so many people that, I have to, Dave Lieb is somebody who I've worked with for a long time. Dave's the senior associate VP at Penn State, and Dave was so important to both of the campaigns that I was involved with at Penn State. Just really solid fundamental knowledge and really committed to the institution. So really somebody who I admire. But there's countless of other individuals, that I worked with. To name a lot of them, I'd get myself in a whole lot of trouble.
It's all good. It's all good, Rod. I just can't thank you enough for for us. You said it is hard to build a relationship over Zoom. This is our first time really properly chatting, and wouldn't have happened without Mark Llewellyn's kind of mentioning, and I appreciate your willingness to jump on here and for providing your perspective on 40 plus years in a sector that has on one hand changed a lot, and I think part of what I take away from what you said is also hasn't changed that much. It's still about the basics. It's still about good stewardship. It's still about the persistence, whether you're sending letters out on a typewriter to try to get a response or doing it through texting or video today. It's got to be the right message delivered the right way in a manner that resonates, and then you gotta keep working at it even when you get hung up on. And I think a lot of that is going to stand the test of time for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's been fun to get to know you, and hopefully there'll be a couple nuggets here that people can take away. And
well, we've been thinking about throwing a party for all of our guests, maybe a Toga party, and if that happens, I'm going to reach out to you for help on planning. All right.
I will. My rules of Toga parties are a little bit rusty, but happy to help.
All right, Rod. Thank you so much for sharing your journey. With that, okay. Brent, signing off Race Community with Rod Kirsch, the Senior Vice President at Grenzebach, Glier & Associates, and the Senior Vice President Emeritus of Development Alumni Relations at Penn State University. Take care.